Socrates. Socrates was the son of Sophronischus, a stonemason, and Phainarete, a midwife. As Plato says in the Theaetetus, he was an Athenian and belonged to the deme of Alopecia. It was thought that he collaborated with Euripides, hence Mnesilochus says, "This new play of Euripides is The Phrygians, for which Socrates supplied the firewood." And he refers to some of Euripides' plays as patched up by Socrates, and Callias in the Captives, A. Why then have you an air so solemn and high-minded? B. I have the right. Socrates is responsible. Aristophanes in the Clouds, it's he who writes for Euripides those witty, wordy tragedies. He studied with Anaxagoras, according to some, but also with Damon, as Alexander says in his Successions. After the condemnation of Anaxagoras, he became a student of Archelaus, the natural philosopher. He also became his beloved, according to Aristoxenus. Duris says that he was a slave and a stoneworker, and some say that the statues of the Graces on the Acropolis are his work, given that they are clothed. Hence Timon, in his Lampoons, says, "From these the sculptor turned away, a prater about laws, an enchanter of the Greeks, an expounder of subtle arguments, a sneerer who mocked the orators, a quasi-Attic dissembler." For he was formidable in rhetoric as well, according to Idomeneus, and Xenophon reports that the 30 prevented him from teaching the art of speech, and Aristophanes portrays him in a comedy, making the weaker argument the stronger, for he was the first, as Favorinus says in his miscellaneous history, with his student Aeschines, to teach rhetoric. Idomeneus confirms this in his work on Socrates and his associates. He was the first to discourse about the conduct of life, and the first of the philosophers to be condemned and executed. Aristoxenus, son of Spintharus, says that he made money. For example, he would invest a sum and collect the interest, and then, when it was spent, invest the sum again. Demetrius of Byzantium says that Crito, captivated by the beauty of his soul, removed him from the workshop and educated him. Having grasped that the study of nature is of no concern to us, Socrates discoursed on ethics in the workshops and the agora, and he claimed to be investigating what evil and what good has been done in your halls. Since he often spoke too vehemently in the course of his inquiries, men pommeled him with their fists or tore his hair out, and for the most part he was laughed at and despised. And he bore all these things so patiently that once, when he had been kicked and someone expressed surprise that he stood for it, Socrates replied, "If a donkey had kicked me, should I have taken it to court?" So much for Demetrius' account. He had no need to go abroad, like most people, except if he had to serve in a military expedition. For the rest of the time he remained where he was and pursued his inquiries all the more zealously with those who conversed with him, not so as to change their minds, but to try to learn the truth. They say that when Euripides had given him the treatise of Heraclitus, and he was asked, "What do you think of it?" he replied, "The parts I have understood are excellent, as are the parts I have not understood, I suppose, except that a Delian diver is needed to plumb their depths." He took care to exercise and keep in good condition. At any rate, he served in the campaign to Amphipolis, and when Xenophon had fallen from his horse in the battle of Delium, Socrates bore him on his back and saved him. And when all the Athenians were fleeing, he himself retired at his own pace, looking around calmly and remaining ready to defend himself should anyone attack him. He also served in the expedition to Potidæa, which was made by sea, for one could not get there on foot, as the war made the land route impassable, It was there that he is said to have stayed in the same position for an entire night, and they say that when he had won the prize of valour after the battle, he resigned it in favour of his beloved Alcibiades, according to Aristippus in the 4th book of his work on the luxuriousness of the ancients. Ion of Chios says that in his youth he went abroad to Samos with Archelaus, and Aristotle says he went to Delphi. He also went to the Isthmus, according to Favorinus in the 1st book of his Reminiscences. He was firm in his convictions and a supporter of the democracy, as is clear from his refusal to obey Critias and his associates when they ordered him to conduct the wealthy Leon of Salamis to them for execution, and he alone voted to acquit the 10 generals, and when it was possible for him to escape from prison, he declined to do so. He even rebuked his friends for weeping over him, and while imprisoned made his finest and most famous remarks. He was self-reliant and honourable, and once, according to Pamphila in the 7th book of her commentaries, when Alcibiades offered him a large piece of land where he might build a house, he said, "And suppose I needed shoes, and you offered me a hide, that I might make myself a pair. Would it not be ridiculous for me to accept it?" Often, when observing the multitude of things for sale, he would say to himself, "How many things I can do without!" And he was continually reciting these iambics. "Silver plate and purple garments are useful for actors in tragedy, not for life." He showed how little he thought of Archelaus of Macedon, Scopa of Cranon, and Eurylochus of Larissa, by not accepting their gifts of money or visiting their courts, and his way of life was so well regulated that on the many occasions when a plague broke out at Athens, he was the only man who did not fall ill. Aristotle says that Socrates lived with 2 women. His first wife was Xanthippe, by whom he had Lamprocles. His second was Myrto, the daughter of Aristides the Just, whom he took without a dowry, and by whom he had Sophroniscus and Menexenus. Others say that he married Myrto first. Still others, including Satyrus and Hieronymus of Rhodes, say that he was married to both at the same time. For they say that when the Athenians, because of a shortage of men, wished to increase their population, they decreed that a man could marry one Athenian woman and have children by another, and that Socrates accordingly did so. He easily disregarded even those who mocked him. He prided himself on the simplicity of his life and never took a fee. He used to say that he most enjoyed the food that least needed a condiment, and the drink that made him least in want of another. He said that the man whose needs are fewest is nearest to the gods. One may grasp this from the comic poets, who, in the course of ridiculing him, unwittingly sing his praises. Thus Aristophanes, "O man who righteously desires great wisdom, what a blessed life you will lead among the Athenians and the rest of the world! For your memory, intelligence, and hardihood are excellent. You never tire, whether standing or walking, never shiver from cold, never hunger for breakfast. From wine you abstain, and from gluttony and all other nonsense." Amypsias, who portrays him in a threadbare cloak, says, "You have come to us, Socrates, the best of a small number of men, and the vainest by far. Well, at least you are hardy. Where could we get you a decent coat? Your sorry state is a reproach to the cobblers. Yet, however hungry he is, the man has never stooped to flatter." This disdainful, high-minded spirit of his is also brought to light by Aristophanes when he says, "Because you swagger along in the streets, gazing askance, barefoot, enduring many ills, and look up at us with a grave and solemn countenance." Yet sometimes, adapting himself to circumstances, he would even don fine clothing, as in Plato's Symposium, when he is on his way to Agathon's house. He was adept at both persuading and dissuading. Thus, after conversing with Theaetetus about knowledge, he sent him away divinely inspired, as Plato says, but when Euthyphro had indicted his own father for the murder of a foreigner, Socrates, after conversing with him about piety, dissuaded him from his course, and by his exhortations he turned Lysis into a highly moral person. He was also adept at basing his arguments on facts. When his son Lamprocles was incensed with his mother, Socrates put the boy to shame, as Xenophon has somewhere mentioned. And when Glaucon, Plato's brother, wished to enter politics, Socrates dissuaded him, as Xenophon says, on the grounds of his inexperience, whereas he encouraged Charmides, who had a natural bent for politics. He aroused the proud spirit in Iphicrates the general by showing him how the gamecocks of Medias the barber flapped their wings at those of Callias, and Glauconides thought that the city should secure Socrates for itself, as it would a pheasant or a peacock. He used to say that it was strange that any man could easily tell you how many sheep he had, but could not name all the friends he had made, so little did they mean to him. Seeing Euclides devoting himself to eristic arguments, he said, "You'll be able to deal with sophists, Euclides, but not with men," for he considered such hair-splitting useless, as Plato says in the Euthydemus. When Charmides offered him some slaves so that he might derive an income from them, he would not accept them, and he took no notice of the beauty of Alcibiades, according to some. He praised leisure as the finest of possessions, as Xenophon says in his Symposium. He declared that there was only one good, knowledge, and only one evil, ignorance, and that wealth and noble birth bring their possessor no honour. On the contrary, they bring every evil. For example, when someone told him that the mother of Antisthenes was a Thracian, he replied, "But did you imagine that so noble a man could have been born of 2 Athenian parents?" And when Phaedo, who had been taken captive in war, was sitting in prison, Socrates had him ransomed by Crito, and made a philosopher of him. Late in life he learned to play the lyre, saying there was nothing strange in studying what one does not know, and he was constantly dancing, since he thought that kind of exercise kept the body in good condition, as Xenophon says in his Symposium. He used to say that his daemonion warned him of future events. He said that well-being was no little thing, but was attained little by little, and he said that he knew nothing except the fact that he knew nothing. He used to say that when people pay high prices for early fruit, they must give up hope of its ripening in season. When someone once asked him, "What is the virtue of a young man?" he replied, "Nothing in excess." He said that a man should study geometry only to the point where he is able to measure the land he either acquires or seeds. When he heard the line in Euripides' play, Auger, where the poet says about virtue, "It's best to let it wander at will," Socrates rose and left the theatre, saying that it was absurd to make a fuss about a slave who could not be found, and to allow virtue to perish in this way. When asked whether or not one should marry, he said, "Whichever you do, you will regret it." He used to say he found it surprising that sculptors take the trouble to turn a block of marble into a perfect likeness of the subject, but take no trouble about themselves, lest they turn out to resemble marble blocks. He thought that young men should constantly examine themselves in the mirror, the handsome that they might prove handsome in character, and the ugly that they might conceal their ugliness by education. When he had invited some rich men to his house, and his wife, Xanthippa, was ashamed of the dinner, he said, "Take heart. If they are reasonable, they will adapt themselves. If worthless, it won't matter to us." He used to say that some men lived to eat, while he himself ate to live. To the man who feared the worthless multitude, he said it was as if someone who rejects a single 4-drachma piece as valueless should accept as valuable a heap of such coins. When Aeschines said, "Poor as I am, I have nothing else to give, but I offer you myself," Socrates replied, "But don't you feel that you are offering me the greatest gift of all?" To someone who, ignored when the 30 rose to power, took it ill, Socrates says, "You don't regret that, do you?" To a man who said, "The Athenians have condemned you to die," he replied, "And nature has also condemned them to die." Some, however, attribute this remark to Anaxagoras. When his wife said, "You die unjustly," he replied, "Would you prefer that I die justly?" When he dreamt that someone said to him, "On the 3rd day you will reach fertile Thea," he said to Aeschines, "On the 3rd day I shall die." When he was about to drink the hemlock, and Apollodorus offered him a beautiful cloak to die in, Socrates asked, "Then is my own cloak good enough to live in, but not to die in?" When told, "So-and-so is speaking badly of you," he said, "It's only because he hasn't learned to speak well." When Antisthenes had turned his cloak so that its tear became visible, Socrates said, "I discern your vanity through your cloak." To someone who asked, "Doesn't so-and-so insult you?" he replied, "Not at all, for what he says doesn't apply to me. He said that we should offer ourselves as butts for the comic poets, for if they say something apt, they will make us better men, and if not, it's of no concern to us." Of Xanthippe, who first scolded him and later drenched him with water, he said, "Didn't I say that Xanthippe's thunder would end in rain?" When Alcibiades said that Xanthippe's scolding was intolerable, he said, "But I am used to it, exactly as if I were constantly hearing the clattering of pulleys. And as for you," he asked, "do you mind the cackling of geese?" "No," replied Alcibiades, "for they provide me with eggs and goslings." To which Socrates replied, "Well, Xanthippe provides me with children." Once, when she had stripped off his coat in the marketplace, and his friends advised him to use his hands to defend himself, he said, "Of course, by Zeus, so that each of you, while we are sparring, may say, 'Good one, Socrates,' and 'Well done, Xanthippe.'" He used to say that he consorted with a cantankerous woman, just as horsemen do with mettlesome horses. "And just as these men," he said, "once they have tamed them, easily master the rest, so I, by living with Xanthippe, will know how to adapt myself to everyone else." For these words and deeds, and others like them, he was honoured by the Pythian priestess when she gave Chaerephon the famous response, "Of all men, Socrates is the wisest." It was mainly for this that he was envied, and especially because he would refute those who had a high opinion of themselves, showing them to be fools, as he surely did in the case of Anytus, according to Plato's Meno. For Anytus, unable to bear being ridiculed by Socrates, began by inciting Aristophanes and his circle against him, and then persuaded Meletus to lodge a complaint against him for impiety and corrupting the youth. The complaint was lodged by Meletus, and the speech delivered by Polyeuctus, as Favorinus says in his miscellaneous history. Polycrates the sophist wrote the speech, as Hermippus says. Others, however, say that it was written by Anytus, and Lycon the demagogue made all the preliminary arrangements. Antisthenes, in his Successions of Philosophers, and Plato in the Apology say that he had 3 accusers, Anytus, Lycon, and Meletus, that Anytus was angered on behalf of the craftsmen and politicians, Lycon on behalf of the orators, and Meletus on behalf of the poets, all of whom he ridiculed. But Favorinus, in the first book of his Reminiscences, says that the speech of Polycrates against Socrates is not genuine, for he says that it contains a reference to the reconstruction of the walls by Conon, which occurred 6 years after the death of Socrates. And that is indeed the case. The indictment against him was drawn up as follows, for it is still available today in the Metruon, says Favorinus. This complaint was lodged under oath by Meletus, son of Meletus of Pythos, against Socrates, son of Sophroniscus of Alopecia. Socrates breaks the law because he does not recognize the gods recognized by the city, and because he introduces other new divinities, and he breaks the law because he corrupts the youth. The penalty is death. As for the philosopher, when he read the speech Lysias had written in his defense, he said, "A fine speech, Lysias, but it is not suitable for me," for it was clearly more forensic than philosophical. When Lysias asked, "But how, if the speech is fine, would it not suit you?" Socrates replied, "Well, wouldn't fine clothes and fine shoes also be unsuitable for me?" Justus of Tiberias, in his work The Garland, says that during the trial Plato ascended to the tribune and said, "Though I am the youngest, men of Athens, of those who have ascended to the speaker's platform," at which point the jurors roared, "Get down!" Socrates was condemned by 281 votes, more than those cast for acquittal, and when the jurors were assessing what he should suffer or what fine he should pay, he said he would pay a fine of 25 drachmas. Eubulides says he agreed to pay 100. And when the jurors raised an uproar, he said, "In view of my services, I propose as a penalty that I be maintained in the Prytaneum at public expense." They sentenced him to death, 80 votes being added to the number cast for conviction. He was imprisoned, and a few days later he drank the hemlock after engaging in many noble discussions, which Plato recounts in the Phaedo. According to some, he composed a paean that begins, "Hail Apollo of Delos and Artemis, renowned children." But Dionysodorus says that the paean is not his work. He also composed a fable, not very successful, in the manner of Aesop, which begins, "Aesop once told the inhabitants of the town of Corinth not to judge virtue by the wisdom of a jury trial." He was thus no longer among men, and the Athenians immediately felt such remorse that they closed the wrestling arenas and gymnasia. They banished his other accusers, but sentenced Meletus to death. They honoured Socrates with a bronze statue, sculpted by Lysippus, which they placed in the Pompeion, and when Anytus visited Heraclea, the people banished him by proclamation that very day, and it was not only in the case of Socrates that the Athenians repented, but in a great many others, for they fined Homer, as Heraclides says, 50 drachmas on the grounds of insanity, and declared that Tyrtaeus was deranged, and honoured Astydamas with a bronze statue before Aeschylus and his fellow poets. And Euripides reproached them in his Palamedes, saying, "You have slain the all-wise, the harmless nightingale of the Muses." So much for that account. But Philochorus says that Euripides died before Socrates. Socrates was born, according to Apollodorus in his chronology, during the archonship of Apsephion, in the 3rd year of the 77th Olympiad, on the 6th of Thargelion, the day when the Athenians purify the city, and the day, according to the Delians, that Artemis was born. He died in the 1st year of the 95th Olympiad, at the age of 70. Demetrius of Phalerum agrees, but others say he died at the age of 60. Socrates and Euripides were both students of Anaxagoras. Euripides was born in the first year of the 75th Olympiad during the archonship of Calliades. It seems to me that Socrates discoursed on natural philosophy as well as ethics, at least where he converses about divine providence. Xenophon mentions this too, though he declares that Socrates talked only about ethics. But Plato, after mentioning Anaxagoras and some other physicists in the Apology, addresses on his own account topics that Socrates disregarded, though he attributes everything to Socrates. Aristotle says that a sorcerer who came to Athens from Syria predicted, among the other evils awaiting Socrates, that he would die a violent death. My own verses about him run as follows: "Drink, Socrates, now that you are in the house of Zeus, for truly did the god call you wise, and wisdom is a god. For you merely received the hemlock from the Athenians, but it is they who, through your mouth, have drained the cup." He had for rivals, as Aristotle says in his third book on poetry, a certain Antilochus of Lemnos and Antiphon the soothsayer, just as Pythagoras had as his rivals Chilon and Onatas, and Homer, during his lifetime, Cyagrus, and after his death, Xenophanes of Colophon, and Hesiod, during his lifetime, Cercops, but after his death, the aforementioned Xenophanes, and Pindar, Amphimenes of Cos, Thales, Pherecydes, Bias, Salurus of Priene, Pittacus, Antimenidas and Alcaeus, Anaxagoras, Sosibius, and Simonides, Timocrian. Among those who succeeded him and were called Socratics, the leaders were Plato, Xenophon, and Antisthenes. Among the 10 traditional Socratics, the 4 most distinguished are Aeschines, Phaedo, Euclides, and Aristippus. We must speak first about Xenophon, then about Antisthenes, later among the Cynics, then about the Socratics, and in turn about Plato, since the 10 schools begin with him, and he himself founded the first academy. This, then, is the order I will follow. There was another Socrates, a historian who wrote a geographical description of Argos, another a peripatetic from Bithynia, another a composer of epigrams, and finally a native of Kos who wrote about the names of the gods.